Yeah, so glad to have you here, Michael, and yes, please start whenever you want.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Gonzalez-Sartorius. It's wonderful to meet with you all. I've said, Dr. Gonzalez-Sartorius said, I've been learning about your work through Aurelio with Poetica Sonora over the last. Everything's okay. Yeah, my connection is stable. Correct?
Yes.
Yeah, great. Okay, just making sure. I've been learning about it over the past 5 or 6 years, I would say, and I had this incredible opportunity to come down and get a tour of UNAM, and the last time that I was down there, which was about a year ago. And yeah, so I'm going to introduce a series of just like the trajectory of my research over this last while. I mean it to be a sort of informal overview, but hopefully we can take up some granular issues as I talk about these things. And you know, I just want to say thank you so much for this invitation, because I think one of the most important things that we can do is actually really strive to create international, conversations around these, audio collections. I think it's a great way to share tools, but I'm less interested in tools as I am with perspectives in terms of like really thinking about the mediality of poetry, what these archives mean in terms of literary history, and what it means about writing in and of itself. I like Dr. Gonzalez-Sartorius mentioned, I work in a lot of different trajectories. I like anytime that I feel like I might formalize a practice and continue in some kind of say academic writing, I start working with dancers, or I start doing strange small press. I'm somebody who's very dedicated to small press poetry production. There's a great tradition in North America, and one of my mentors is Charles Bernstein. Charles is a formidable thinker of many things, including sound and poetry and performance, as you all probably know. But really importantly for me, the tradition that Charles fosters is one of the small press poetry tradition, and what's fascinating about the small press poetry tradition is that the mediality of the practice of the materialization of poetry is so wildly diverse, and so it's kind of it's if you're immersed in this tradition, then you have to acknowledge that poetic practice is exceptionally vast in terms of its perspectives, uses of language, the way that writing is done, and the materialities often, because often the poetry takes place across numerous materialities. And so I think that's really one of the most important parts for me is that I am engaged with the small press poetry tradition, and I see that as what I'm really and so as I introduce the things that I would like to talk about this evening, please know that I do so in wanting to really begin a conversation with you all. I was thinking about I very much desire to learn about small press poetry traditions in Mexico, and across the Americas. I have a dear friend that I work closely with, Carlos Soto Roman in Chile, and I'm just blown away by the diverse amount of practices that are take up in the Chilean tradition of poetry, from especially under Pinochet, of just the various forms that poets had to take up in order to not be censored, essentially. And so I really like, for me, this is one of the most exciting things that we can do, is to learn about both the perspectives on what poetry and poetics is and does, and also the forms and the materialities that poets play with. And I think when we do that, we become more interesting poets, more interesting literary historians and literary critics. And I'll begin by saying I'm going to share my screen in a moment, and I'll just need to figure out how to do that again on Zoom. But I just want to say that my personal engagement with contemporary poetry begins in audio archives. I studied philosophy, and I was really interested in linguistics. And actually, I'll share my screen now because it's a good time. My engagement with poetry audio recordings begins in a really interesting place. So if you can see my cursor here, this is, I think, around Mexico City here, just above New York. Here is where I'm at in Montreal. And equally as far as Mexico City is to Montreal, I lived up in a place called Fort Good Hope, which is up in the Arctic Circle. Exactly where the Arctic Circle and the Mackenzie River intersect, essentially. And so it's an incredible place. It's a place where it's about minus 40 degrees Celsius for I think a quarter of the year. And in the summertime, it has full 24 hours of light. And I moved here in my early 20s, and with my partner at the time, who was doing work on the impact of oil and gas extraction on indigenous peoples in the Arctic. And before moving to Fort Good Hope, I had always lived in places that were really library rich. And I've always been somebody who's like spent a large part of my life in libraries. And I was really searching for materials that I could, in Fort Good Hope, this is the village. It's about 300 people. And there was no library there, but there was in one of the buildings there was 4 computers, and I at the time because I had just finished a degree in philosophy at Boston University, I was very much into the writings of Ludwig Wittgenstein, and I wanted to read some Ludwig Wittgenstein, and I was searching on the computer, and next thing you know, I find these writings by a person named Marjorie Perloff, who maybe you know about, who writing about Wittgenstein and the poems of John Ashbery, for instance. And I was like, oh, this is really interesting. You know, I'd studied modernist poetry kind of on my own, reading T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound. I had read Dante, but never really been immersed into poetry. I cared about literature, but in reading these articles by Marjorie Perloff about Wittgenstein and contemporary poetry, I was just like, wow, I didn't know poetry can do this. I always thought poetry was about your deepest emotions, and here were people who were exploring how we make meaning in language, and doing the work that I thought was so fascinating that Wittgenstein was doing, and but doing it in a literary form. And I thought that was so fascinating. And so this was on the Electronic Poetry Center, a digital repository, and I followed the digital repository Electronic Poetry Center to another one, and I started called PennSound, which I'm sure you all know of, and I was blown away. I would sit in this room with 4 computers, the 2 hours a day that it was open, and I would just listen to poetry audio recordings, and I really started to my whole immersion into, say, the poetry, Anglophone poetry of North America in the past 60 years is not through a textual form. It's through the audio, and also I'll say too, importantly, that critically, my engagement with critical, I can't call it writing, but critical discussions of poetry and poetics is also through PennSound, because something that's really incredible about PennSound is that it has a great deal of discussions, roundtables, plenaries, and people, bringing into poem talk, for instance, people discussing poetics and perspectives on poetry. And so there's always this kind of dialogical model that's built at the same time that one experiences recordings of individual poems. And for me, that's really important. This mixture of like the critical dialogue with combined together with individual poems and poetry readings. One of the people that really blew me away was this guy, David Antin. He lived in San Diego, so not far from Tijuana, for a large part of his life. He taught, I think, for a while at UCSD. He's I wonder if people are familiar with his work. He's kind of like a proto-language poet, in that he was very close with Bernstein, but also very close with Jerome Rothenberg. So ethnopoetics person. And David Antin's works of poetry were always performance-based. They were, he would show up somewhere, he would give a loose theme of what he would talk about, and he would do an improvised talk somewhere between a half an hour to an hour on a subject. And often they were contextually focused on that specific meeting, that specific place, the people in the room. He is really sort of an interesting formal contextualist poet, while kind of intoning this rich tradition of oral poetries that have been the case since Homer. He famously says something like, if Robert Frost is a poet, I don't want to be a poet. If Robert Lowell is a poet, I don't want to be a poet. If Socrates is a poet, I'll consider it. This is from one of his works. And for me, it was fascinating because learning about David Antin, and he's an oral poet in that he gives these oral talks that are poems, that he calls poems, but they have a very specific materiality. The tape cassette that he puts on the table that he records the thing, the room itself, that is a meeting space, that is an institutional space, that is an art space, that is a materiality. The way that this becomes a that it gets transcribed into a book and formally edited and laid out in a very specific manner, that is another materiality. The way that it shows up on PennSound, that is another materiality. And so there's this material chain that I think is really fascinating with David Antin's works. And I don't think I had the understanding at the time. So here I am, I'm living in a primarily indigenous context, Northern Dene, Gwich'in, and Inuvialuktun people sort of around the Arctic Circle. And one thing that a lot of settler colonial scholars, when they talk about indigenous literatures, they really impress the fact on the oral status of its poetry. And yes, there is an oral status to the poetry in that often, I mean, it's very diverse and takes up all sorts of different practices. So just to claim it all under one umbrella is a semi-ridiculous thing to do. But one often settler colonial perspectives on indigenous oral literatures deny the material practices of oral poetries. They deny the fact that these poetries are expressed in certain contexts, that they have a very specific communal, collective, architectural mode, that there's all sorts of inscriptions, be it forms of beading, forms of sculpture and woodwork, forms of architecture that are all relayed and in conversation with the live voiced expression, as well as the embodied aspect of it in terms of how the poet is embodied and how the listeners interact with that embodiment during the expressions. So yeah, I'd say this is a really major moment for me, is like listening to David Antin, really trying to grasp what I was doing and the cultures that I was living in the Northwest Territories. And from that point, I wanted to be a poet. I wanted to write poetry. I started doing a Master's of Fine Arts after thinking I would never go back to university or never go to grad school. I studied in a very, I'll come back to that. I studied in a very conservative poetry writing program. I had never taken a course on a workshop, a creative writing workshop before. And I show up there learning about contemporary poetry by studying it through these digital repositories. And then I get there and I learn that everybody that is in this program has only read poems that are in books and in anthologies. And I almost got kicked out of the program because it just felt like such a sad thing to do to poetry, to limit it to you know, a lineated expression that happens on the page and looks a certain way that a lot of lyric poems do. I mean, I like poems that do that. I write poems that do that, and I'm interested in it. But part of being a poet is the formal innovation with language. And so for me, poets should be writing on billboards and be making installational works and doing collaborative works with people that are performed and thinking about textiles. And so I really, I had a really tough time. I thought that these 2 years of an MFA, I would get there and I would just write and write and write and write. And I found that I didn't want to do any writing in this context because it was so closed. Luckily, I went to a gathering and I happened to meet Al Filreis and Charles Bernstein. And at this gathering at the Banff Center in the Rocky Mountains in Alberta, I told them, I was like, hey guys, like, I'm really thankful for PennSound. Al Filreis and Charles Bernstein are the two people that started PennSound. And I was so thankful for what they had done. And I told them the story that of listening to David Antin up on the Arctic Circle. And, you know, Al Filreis was like, this is one of the reasons why we created this open access archive. This is one of the reasons why we build this thing, is so people from these far-flung places can have access to it. And so for me, that's something that is so important in considering, you know, right now we have this major court case in the United States that's trying to shut down the Internet Archive, an incredible digital commons to access literature. And it's such an important political act, I think, to make digital collections, digital literature free and accessible and circulable on the internet. It's one of the most important things that I think we can do in research institutions, is to open up resources. And in doing so, you know, this is not to say that the institution is open and accessible to all. It's obviously not. There's all sorts of barriers. But I think this is a really important way to open up one possibility to bring other peoples into discussions about literature. And so after I told Al and Charles, they were just like, we got to bring you in on this. We're starting this journal, Jacket 2, which was an incredible, one of the first online critical poetics and contemporary poetry journals, started in Australia. And the person who had started it, John Tranter, was just retiring. And wonderfully, Charles Bernstein and Al Filreis had worked it out to receive digital archives of Jacket 2 and to put it up on a website and to reformulate a journal. And they wanted to bring me in on it and for me to continue working with the PennSound archive as a kind of editor and to do so from the Arctic. And so if I learned a lot in my original immersion into these archives, into these digital repositories, up in Fort Good Hope, at first, my real, I feel like the way that I became, my beginning of becoming a literary critical writer or a researcher begins in what happened next, which is my job was to find interesting audio recordings, like the Susan Howe and Bernadette Mayer one, and to transcribe them. And so I would just go around I'd listen to all the different recordings, and I'd just be like, this discussion is incredible. This symposium on poetry in the 1960s, we have to transcribe this. This piece about Robert Creeley talking about William Carlos Williams, and really trying to think about lyric practices and quotidian speech, like we have to transcribe this. And so in doing this transcription, and I really want to advocate this for any of you working in the Poetica Sonora collection, is like transcription is the best way to learn about the contents on the granular level of what you might be accessing. And if you have a mode to publish these transcriptions in terms of a literary journal, it's incredible, because one thing that I've learned about digital repositories is they work best when there's all sorts of different interactive ways of interaction, modes of interaction with them. And so having the digital repository is great, having events around the digital repository, having readings and listenings to them, these are all incredible. But having, say, an online journal that can anchor and move back and forth and include the recordings, these are all ways of creating spaces of interactivity that I think are formally really important in the creation of digital repositories. So just to wrap up talking about this transcription, I learned so much about granular details about the history and people battling over, like, Robert Duncan said this in 1960, and this opens up a new possibility in American poetry, and no, that's not important because it's just a reformulation of Ezra Pound saying this 30 years earlier. People arguing about these facts. But what I learned in transcribing poets is how fascinating certain poets are in their spoken expression, and how in transcribing people you learn the depths of syntax in such an incredible way. Bob Perlman, who's like one of the great American poets of the later 20th century, is possibly one of the most syntactically complex speakers I've ever come up against. And I felt like I understood his poetry in such a new way in transcribing his informal speaking in symposiums, for instance. And so I think it's a really fascinating way to not only learn about literary history, but to learn about like linguistic practices, because poets should be good at and have a really wonderful self-attention to their language and their verbal expression. And so when you study it on that granular level, you can really you learn about the richness and the rich possibilities of syntax. After this immersion, I went on to do a PhD, and I really wanted to talk about digital repositories, because as I started, here I was at this very conservative creative writing program where I felt like I had no engagement and real interest in what other people thought of poetry. But I started meeting people through different publications online in different spaces, and I started meeting all of these people who had a formation in poetry also through these digital repositories. And I'll point out the one here. This is the Electronic Poetry Center. It was started with by Los Pequeño Glacier, Cuban American with ties to Mexico, actually. I think his mother is from Mexico and his father's from Cuba, but grew up in Texas and then California. And then started by Kenneth Goldsmith, II.iv, which was actually hosted. II.iv servers, to avoid US copyright law, were hosted in Mexico City at a design school called Centro for a number of years. And I've written a chapter on this, and so I hope to share that with you at some point in the future, because it's really thinking about digital repositories and intellectual property, which I think would be an interesting thing to have a discussion about.
Sorry, Michael, has he moved the repository from Centro? Because as far as I knew, it still is in Centro.
Yeah, for a while it was in Croatia. Something happened where I think the funding, the way that they built a kind of shell company to pay for the hosting in case Centro, the people at Centro, please don't distribute this further. I know this is being recorded, but they essentially built a kind of shell company to host UvuWeb, so that if they ever got sued for violating intellectual property, that the school would not be affected. And I think there was some uncertainty around its funding, and this group from Croatia were willing to take it on. And then I think about 4 years ago, it's migrated all to Iceland. And this incredible digital activist group called Custodians of the Web are now hosting it on servers in Iceland that apparently will never shut down UvuWeb, because these guys are like the best hackers and sort of builders of digital infrastructure that you could imagine. And so they built all of these mirrors for UvuWeb to assure that it can never be shut down. So,
right. Thank you.
yeah, for sure. And so again, just to really underscore something about these digital repositories, is that they really show poetic practice as being multimedial. And necessarily so. And all these people at that conservative creative writings program that I was in, they thought I was crazy in trying to advocate for a kind of poetry. And I'd be like, read Aristotle. You think that I'm somehow being some kind of postmodernist, but if you read Aristotle, the first book of poetry, the first book of the Poetics, first chapter of Poetics talks about the mediality of poetics and the intermediality of poetics. And Aristotle says some wild things it can involve dance and horses and oral epic poetry and all these kinds of things, but this is what poesis, composition or literary composition is about. And so I think it's a really important thing to understand that that poetry has always been, in my sense of it, and cross-culturally, something that has involved a lot of medial forms. And that's really articulated very well in these digital repositories. And so I started writing during my PhD a number of pieces. These are ones that are that I've published so far. They're all studies of digital repositories, essentially, and all of them thinking about sound. I think Poetics in a Network Digital Milieu, with all of them are up on my website, is probably the clearest overview of my PhD dissertation. And while I was writing about literary subjects, I also, I was studying sound and poetry and performance. I showed up at grad school to begin my PhD at a moment where Occupy Wall Street was happening. A lot of major college strikes all across the United States. And in Canada, specifically in Montreal, we had a 200-day strike that ended up shutting down the provincial government of Quebec, led by students against raising tuition. Quebec has the lowest tuition by a lot compared to the rest of Canada, and it's like 1/100th of what the tuition is in the United States. And students really fought to keep it this way. And so as I'm studying, textuality, vocality, performance, I have this confrontation with, Occupy Wall Street and the human microphone, which was a mode of expression for amplifying voices during a lot of the Occupy Wall Street protests, and a number of Indigenous uprisings against the Canadian government that were called Idle No More. And I really began to think about sound, performance, and language beyond the literary. And so I've written a number of essays as well that extend beyond, that really try to take literary, like the things that literary, historical, and literary textual scholarship is good at, which is like, close reading and analysis of texts, thinking about difference and iteration in different modes. And I really try to apply that to live events of political and social struggle. And so that really is an important thing for me, is really trying to, I love the literary and the literary historical, but I also am interested in taking these tools and these modes of analysis and bridging it out into a living context. Just to break down a couple of important points of, I'm starting to take my PhD after I finished my PhD, I think 5 years ago. Really, it was actually at my defense. And after I finished it, I couldn't stand looking at what it was that I had written for my PhD. I just needed a break from it. And so I took a break from it, and now I'm really interested in it again, and I'm turning it into a book, thankfully. I feel like I finally have the courage to think about it in a new way. And so the working title for this book is Articulating Poetics, Media History and the Archivization of Poetry, 1995 to 2015. I'll break that down. I'm interested in the 1995 to 2015 because 1995 is just prior to the World Wide Web. And what's really fascinating about, which sort of appears for the first time in 1996 in popular use. And the Electronic Poetry Center is a pre-World Wide Web internet site, which is fascinating. It was written on something called Gopher Space, which was an early internet forum. People really don't, I try to keep up on digital scholarship as much as possible, of history of the digital, and there's very, very little exchange about Gopher Space. So I think I'm recomposing this chapter on the Electronic Poetry Center, and I think it's really interesting. And then UbuWeb is necessarily a World Wide Web. It's like Ken Goldsmith famously says he saw the GIF, the digital image format GIF. Some people say GIF. Saw the Netscape Navigator GIF image that was like a live image, and he's just like, I knew I had to start UbuWeb when I saw that digital image, because he's just like, for the first moment, he felt like he could share the kind of multimedial practices of poetry that he had been so interested in. And then PennSound is really, PennSound comes, maybe it starts in 2003, so it starts 7 years after UbuWeb and 8 years after the Electronic Poetry Center. And it really learned the lessons from both of these sites and really tried to build a functioning digital repository for World Wide Web 1 that goes into World Wide Web 2. But I ended at 2015 because it's kind of when the stack form of digital publication that we are familiar with through social media, like Facebook and Twitter, and probably even TikTok as a stack form, really sort of overtakes the practice, the archival practices of World Wide Web and early World Wide Web 2. One of the things that I really advocate for in this work is the digital repository as a unique archival genre. It's not an archive. Sometimes I mess up my own speech, and I sometimes call these things archives. I've probably done it 2 or 3 times while I've been talking now. But a digital repository is not an archive, and this is a really important thing. When we call it an archive, we upset librarians and and information scientists because archives are organized and they have very strict protocols. And so when we think about the protocols of a digital repository, when we stop calling it a digital archive and recognize it for what it is, that's when we get into the really good stuff. Like, digital repositories are messier than archives. They have a lot of individual idiosyncratic selection of materials. They're messy in terms of formats. Sometimes you'll find, you know, part is an MP3 here, sometimes a WAV file here, sometimes you'll see it as a video file, you know, .mov format. So there's interesting things about how it's organized, the protocols for its selection, what is archived, the format, and it's very importantly, it's protocols for circulation. You know, if they are getting licensed materials, if they're respecting intellectual property like PennSound does and not like UvuWeb does. UvuWeb puts anything up and waits for a cease and desist letter. And even after it gets a cease and desist letter, it still keeps it up there because it says, well, if you want to sue me, let's do it. And knowing that the people won't sue Ken Goldsmith. One of the ways that I became interested in these thinking about these digital repositories is through thinking about Stuart Hall's writings on articulation. I would point you to a dialogue actually with Lawrence Grossberg, the great cultural media theorist, cultural studies media historian. I think it's called On Postmodernity or something like that. And, you know, Stuart Hall, I think approaching digital repositories and digital textuality through a perspective that Stuart Hall offers is actually a really, really fascinating one, and really offers a lot in terms of critical perspective. And the way that it does that is he focuses on the term articulation. And by articulation, he means he gives a really basic metaphor. In England, a truck, you know, you have a truck that maybe has a really big container on the back that is delivering goods, you know, one of these things that has 16 wheels and has all sorts of things in it. So a truck can be connected to any container, and any container can be connected to any truck. And that point of connection, what makes those trucks in England are actually called articulated lorries. Lorry is the English term for a truck. And so importantly, these things can be built and rebuilt and unbuilt in any kind of way. And Stuart Hall says the form of connection is between different elements. Articulation is the form of the connection between different elements under certain conditions. And so if we study the form of the connections, the different elements, and the specific conditions of an articulation, that's a really fantastic way, I think, to approach in a media historical methodology for addressing digital repositories. And so that's how I'm approaching. And what importantly for me, the reason why this is so important is because any major writings on digital poetry, digital poetics, they often tend to cite media poetics of, say, a figure like Marshall McLuhan. I don't know if this is just a Canadian thing, but I hear it often in the United States as well. Marshall McLuhan is somebody who's just like, you know, the printing press was built and then life changed and the printing press changed this and then the radio and then people change culture. And so it's often these histories of geniuses who build something and these things change culture. But really, if we study articulation, we know that there's so much more nuance than anything that Marshall McLuhan proposes, which is techno-determinist, like, and so yeah, I really want to advocate for a Stuart Hall approach to digital artifacts, because it's where in studying the way, say, you know, Bitcoin is built under the forms of connection, the different elements and the certain conditions, we can understand both how it's built and possibly the way to unbuild it, you know? And so I think it's a really exceptional political tool to be able to study it from a media historical perspective, and that's what I'm trying to do in this book. I'll talk about this. I'm going to take about 10 more minutes. Is that okay? Yeah. Yeah, great, wonderful. Just because I want to leave room to chat, and I see that we're approaching the hour. As I was studying these digital repositories, UbuWeb, PennSound, and Electronic Poetry Center, I knew that there was this other digital repository of poetry audio recordings in the United States that was actually bigger, had more recordings than all of these other repositories possibly together. The recordings were made in the 1930s, and they were all in Serbo-Croatian and Albanian. And that is the Milman Parry collection of oral literature, which is in Harvard. That's Milman Parry. I'm curious. I wonder. Dr. Gonzalez-Sartorius is a philologist, so you probably know. You've worked in philology, so you probably know Milman Parry's work to a certain degree.
Not that well, no.
Okay. People call Milman Parry the Charles Darwin of Homeric studies. And they do so because when he's an American who he did his PhD in at the Sorbonne in the late 1920s. And there's this thing that's been debated for about 300 or 400 years at that point called the Homeric question. Who is Homer? Who was the author of Homer? How did he compose the Odyssey and the Iliad? Were they oral compositions that were then written down? Were they written from their start? Was Homer more than one person? And Milman Parry, using essentially early proto-linguistic methodologies, was able to discern that the Homeric poems were, he couldn't say Homer was this person who lived at this time, but he could say in an exceptionally convincing way that the Homeric poems were oral, embodied, performed works that circulated probably for about 300 or 400 years before they were written down to text. And the way he was able to show that was through this linguistic analysis of studying the epithets of the Homeric poems, and to show he basically did this incredible formal analysis to show the metrical form, and show that metrical form was proof of their live improvisational performance. It was really incredible. It's very, very, very fascinating work. And when Milman Parry defended his PhD at the Sorbonne, this guy happened to come who was a Slovenian folklorist who was traveling around in the 1920s in Yugoslavia, in the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, making these incredible recordings of oral bardic epic poets, and said, listen, Milman Parry, if you really want to test out these theories that you have about the Homeric poems, you really need to go to Yugoslavia and study these poets who, they might not be able to write their name down on a page, but they can sing and perform 9,000 lines of epic verse over an entire day. And so Milman Parry did that. He went and assembled a team in 1933 and started taking transcriptions of different guslars. That's the name of this particular kind of epic poet in Yugoslavia at the time. This is one of his two assistants taking down dictation from these things, these poets, and he even used an early parlograph recording instrument. But he came up against a real problem. A lot of these poems happened over 3 or 4 hours in terms of their recitation, and at that time, what the specific thing that Milman Parry wanted to study was the improvisational form of how these poets. So he wanted to be able to study their metrical formation in live performance, and so this parlograph could only record for 6 minutes, and then he would have to stop it and then take off the wax cylinder and put another one back on and tell the poet to keep going. But what he needed was something that could record for 5 or 6 hours. And so he finished that first tour of the Balkans that summer and went back to Harvard and began working with a scientist, an inventor. And he ended up building what I believe to be is the first ever continuous audio recording device. You can see it right here on this picture. It's two aluminum plate turntables and a microphone, 2 turntables and a microphone. It's great. He built this device, and he even built it. So there's another picture of the recording device, and this is really where he was made. Like, I actually stood at this exact spot it's in the Dinaric mountains in Croatia, present day. This is one of the places where Milman Parry made a series of incredible recordings with an illiterate epic poet who was a shepherd. Here's another place. He even built a car, a Ford Model T, that could hold and protect the device on the terrible roads that they're driving in the mountainous roads of Yugoslavia, in order to hold the device and also charge the device, so that he can. So that car is actually part of the technical apparatus of the recording device in a fascinating way. And here's his main assistant, Nikolai Vojnović, who was a Herzegovinian poet and guslar himself. He was a poet who can play the one-string instrument that poets often performed with in the Balkans, and he was the main person who. So Milman Parry is quite a famous figure at least in classical studies. He's probably not known very well in poetry, but this person, Nikolai Vojnović, who's the person on the left on my screen, without the beard, he is the person who really, everything that Milman Parry did, Nikolai Vojnović essentially facilitated. He made everything happen. And so I'm really in this history of the Milman Parry collection of recordings. I'm really trying to think a lot about this figure, Nikolai Vojnović, who worked with Parry for 3 years. Parry dies by a terrible mistake. He had a small pistol in his suitcase and accidentally shot himself in the stomach, and so died before he can finish his research. His main student takes up his research, and Nikolai Vojnović and Albert Lord worked very closely on the poetry, on all of these audio collections of South Slavic poetry. And Nikolai Voinovich disappears in World War II. And so I'm really trying to, I've tracked down his family in a very, very small village on the border of Croatia, in Bosnia and Herzegovina in Croatia. I tracked down his family. I tracked down a distant relative of his, and I've been interviewing the family. They're still living members of the family that are able to talk about Nikolai's involvement with this collection in the 1930s. And so that's I don't know if this is part of the Articulating Poetics book. It could be a really fascinating final chapter talking about this other digital repository that is also one of the most substantial collections of poetry audio in the United States, at least. And yeah, so that's or this might be a book in and of itself. This might be a separate book. I may have come upon a new book project in doing this research. And yeah, I had wanted to talk about editions, collaborations, and poetic works. I mean, Dr. Gonzalez-Lector has brought up a lot of these things, the dialogues, the document series. This is a modern. This is the really wonderful sonic materialities thing that I still really love. This is a new project, Aural Poetics. This just came out, and I'm going to be spending the next 2 months launching this all over Europe, which will be really fun. I write poetry too, and a lot of my poetry comes out of transcribing audio and reformulating it in new ways. I'm working with a guy from the band Broken Social Scene. I don't know if anybody knows this band, but he's making a really cool audio book of the Ritual Lights. His name's Andrew Whiteman. The first audio recording of it is going to be coming out in the next month or two. Oh, that was a bit of the audiobook. And yeah, and I've been working with Dana Michelle, who's this really incredible dancer and choreographer. We're launching this book. And probably the most important collaboration that I'm doing these days is working with Dylan Robinson. I hope that you're reading Dylan Robinson's book, because I think this is possibly one of the most important books in sound studies that's been written in probably since Jonathan Stern's work. This is a really incredible thing. I'm working with Dylan. He and I are writing a book about this project by R. Murray Schafer, who's kind of the guy who made the word soundscape. He coined it in popular use, the word soundscape, and he does so with this book, The Vancouver Soundscape. And essentially, Dylan and I's take on Murray Schafer, he's a hugely important figure in Canadian artistic discourse, but we think of him as articulating the most settler colonial perspective on listening. And so we're really interested in imagining, in articulating how Murray Schafer's perspective is a colonial one, and really thinking about anti-colonial and indigenous resurgent modes of listening against R. Murray Schafer's protocols for listening. And this is probably one of the most exciting projects that I'm working on. It's in its very new stages. We're going to start working on it we've done the setup for it, and now starting in June, we're going to be working on this very, very much in depth. And that's it. I look forward to talking with you all. This is a picture of Cecilia Vicuña, her Kipu-based works. Something that I didn't really talk about in the presentation is really thinking about inscriptive practices. So maybe that's something we can bring up in conversation. Yeah, I'll take a break for a minute and take a sip of water.
Yes, thank you so much, Michael.
Yeah, thank you.
Like wrap up some of the things in order to open up the the dialogue. I'm sure that many of our members of Poética Sonora have questions or things that they want to comment on. I wanted you to start this dialogue with Poética Sonora by telling us about your own trajectory, because I find it's beside fascinating, also a very good and stimulating example of how students can also develop in many different directions, and all the possibilities that open up. Of course, they are not open from the beginning. One has to open them. One has to find these paths, and of course take advantage of something that sometimes we call the fortune to meet someone, but you also have to make the step to continue the dialogue with these great people that you've met and that have encouraged you to continue in this path, even though you didn't start as properly in the field of literature, but how you have developed. This is amazing. And also all the things that you've done that become in a certain way, when looking back, when tracking back all the steps, quite complementary. They sum up in a fascinating and very enriching way. So
All right, thank you. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the very interesting introduction. It's also lots of resources, right, that we are always looking for this kind of texts, books, sites that would help us to get in contact with things that we wouldn't find otherwise, right? So basically what I would want to maybe ask is, what is the role of translation in all of this cycle, right? How can we understand translation maybe as a tool to communicate the importance that we find in these articulations, right? As you mentioned, and that maybe for us working with audio repositories that maybe are part of a local institution, or that pertain to local traditions or to local, let's say, art movements, for example, how can we mobilize them through translation? Have you had any experience with this, or is there any tool that you could recommend in this sense?
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel like I haven't thought enough about translation, which is strange. But I'll say this, that I'm about to head back to Paris, and I'm meeting with a group all at the Sorbonne in 2 weeks, who have started this incredible digital repository of French audio recordings. And I was there in November, and when they introduced this digital repository to me, I was just like, oh, you guys need to be in touch with Poética Sonora, because it had this really incredible similarity in terms of the way that it was built. And then, while I was there, somebody else did another talk about a really great Italian digital repository of poetry. And then there's one that I'm slightly associated with here in Montreal, which is called Spoken Web. I've worked a little bit with it over the years. That's all based on a singular reading series in Montreal from the 70s, 60s, and 70s. And so, I think the role translation, I think, can play two really interesting roles. I would say is that when the people who manage and work with these digital repositories get to meet with one another and get to exchange what they're doing, we learn really importantly the protocols for building these digital repositories show a lot about literary perspectives. Our approach to the literary is formally inscribed into the construction of these digital repositories. And so it's really interesting to think of the ways that say this repository here and that repository there have constructed the protocols for the repository in fundamentally different ways, and also studying, you know, the way that they've done it differently. And then I think about, so that's one level. I think that like translation happens not necessarily on a linguistic level, but it happens on a formal contextual level. On a linguistic level, you know, I'm really drawn to repositories that have an internationalist multilinguistic perspective. UbuWeb has it, EPC has it, and so does PennSound. I mean, it's fascinating that spoken web, the fact that it happens in, you know, the most bilingual city in America, in North America, in United States and Canada, doesn't have any French audio recordings. How wild is that, Aurelio? Like, it's such a strange thing. And so I mean so I mean, I might be wrong. There might be a little bit of French in there somewhere, but you know, I think there's another really incredible digital repository that's all JPEG files and PDFs, that's started by Craig Dworkin, called the Eclipse Archive, and a really important site for accessing very difficult to find poetic works that I think are instrumental to the 20th century, the later 20th century, Eclipse Archive. And, you know, Craig has done an incredible work, you know, holding and recirculating in a new milieu works that, for instance, Tripwire Journal, which is up on this whole top row shelf, is all Tripwire Journal. It's done out of Oakland, and this is one of my one critique of the majority of USA poetic culture is that it's so monolingual. It's so Anglo-centric, and Tripwire Journal is one of the journals that has a real internationalist multilingual perspective, and I think we really need to build these spaces. We really need to recognize, like, you know, I live in Montreal, which everybody thinks of as a French and Anglophone city, but there's poetry and literary practices that are happening that are in, you know, Arab, a huge Lebanese population here, huge African and Creole, different Creole forms of Haitian, French, large Vietnamese population, you know, so yeah, how we can think about these, how we think we can foster traditions that like acknowledge translation, the fact of translation, the importance of translation, and internationalist multilingual perspectives. I think that's one of the most important things that we could do with these repositories. Yeah, thank you for that question, Pablo.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much for the answer. It's really food for thought, right? All of these things, they are a constant discussion that translators and experts from many different disciplines are having constantly, right? I mean, again, trying to draw back from what you shared with us, I would also try and save this approach, this multidisciplinary approach that you have with sound studies, and the similarities that it has with contemporary translation, right? The need that we've come to realize that we cannot do everything by ourselves, and that we must rely on the knowledge of others, right? That they very generously share through these kinds of archives, repositories, that at the end they are a very powerful tool. So yeah, thank you very much for the answer.
Yeah, I mean, I would be fascinated to know the ways that like Poetica Sonora is engaging with like other linguistic practices, other practices of the literary in Mexico. I know that there's a number of indigenous languages all throughout Mexico, and I don't know them very well. But yeah, it just, you know, these kinds of things, and you know, you can't quite translate the literary from culture to culture too. And so, you know, this is why I say things like inscriptive practices, is because I'm really like, my interest in poetry is like, oh, poetry is this incredible form to say something really specifically in language that can preserve through time.
Mhm.
You know? And so what are other ways that we, you know, preserve or transmit memory through other forms of inscription as well? And so that's that's why I really try to maybe defer from the literary, because once we start working with people from other cultures and other perspectives, the literary doesn't translate. And by assuming that the literary will go as the transmitter of memory from culture to culture, then we lose what's can be really significant in creating cross-cultural dialogues.
Mhm. I think Jorge has already shared his question.
Yeah, cool. Do phonotexts escape archivization? Would they be more stacked texts in as much as they reveal the impossibility of the archive? Oh, this is a great question. This is kind of what I try to address in this essay that's like very much a first draft of something that's called Fugitive Sound, that's published on Jacket 2. You know, it's and what initiated that writing was a coincidence. I read Thomas Edison's writings on the first audio recording device he made, and he had this fantasy of capturing. He uses this word, capturing what was considered fugitive sounds. And in Thomas Edison's time, or wait, am I saying, no, it's Thomas Edison, yeah. In Thomas Edison's time, you know, the word fugitive was very much connected to slavery. And the fugitive were fugitive bodies of people who were enslaved, who sought to escape places in which slavery was held. And so necessarily Edison inscribes within his ideological framing for this audio recording device this notion that is tied to culturally to slavery. And so I found that interesting that nobody had kind of commented on the ideology of his language. Oops, sorry about that. Ideology of his language. And at the same time, I came across Fred Moten. Do you guys know Fred Moten? He's possibly one of the most important theorists. He wrote a book called In the Break on the Black radical tradition and has written a number of other books. Incredible poet too. He talks about sound and fugitivity in this incredible talk of his. It's never been published as an essay, and it talks about how one of the sort of tactics of the Black radical tradition in the United States is to forever work out to stay in a state of fugitivity, essentially, to forever escape these kinds of modes that confine compositional practice. And he means this in a literary musical sense, in terms of talking about jazz and Black experimental poetics of the Jim Crow era in the United States. But he also means it too in terms of physical bodies trying to, like, that Black life escapes the enclosure of slavery and strives towards a sort of conviviality against slavery, then anti-Black racism and its other modes that continue through the days. So I found that to be a really interesting way to think about the collections. And to come back to your specific question, do phonotexts escape archivization? I mean, you know, in their transmission, and if they're downloadable, you know, they on these digital repositories, they are allowed a certain kind of movement, a certain kind of circulation that is really important. The downloadable factor is really important, because in creating a downloadable file, you create the possibility for other digital repositories. And, you know, Charles Bernstein said this wonderful thing to me years ago that stayed with me is, you know, PennSound is a digital repository of MP3s. It's MP3s are not the best audio format for preserving audio. It's you know, the WAV file is traditionally because it preserves all sorts of elements that are fairly undetectable to human ears, but are really important for preserving the sound. But Charles says, you know, I believe in preservation through transmission. And this for me is like one of the most important elements: preservation through transmission. That in allowing things to be free and in allowing things to circulate, you give up control of these things and allow them to sort of leak and spread and you know, enter into new communities of exchange where, you know, people may start making weird mixtapes with Frank O'Hara and Gertrude Stein, for instance, or something like that. And you know, it might have, you know, I see that magnetic tape cassettes are becoming really big again, because vinyl is becoming really expensive. And so a lot of cool bands are publishing on tape cassettes again. And I like to imagine, like, you know, somebody taking Poetry Audio Archives and making a monthly mixtape on audio cassettes and circulating that into the world. And so it's not that they escape archivization, it's that the archivization changes. So as opposed to being preserved in a single strongly enforced site or server, the phonotext is allowed to circulate in all of these other new contexts. And that is a form of archivization. That transmission is a form of archivization. Yeah, thank you for that question. That's it. That's it. They reopen the notion of the archive. That's it. And I mean, this is what I'm really thankful for. Who's the performance? Diane Taylor at NYU, who wrote The Archive and the Repertoire.
Yes.
Really important book for me years ago. I haven't looked at it again in a while. And that's, you know, the repertoire is an archival formation as well. Mm-hmm. You know, the embodied exchange of meaning and signification is that living form. And so I'm really interested in that reopening of the notion of the archive in this, you know, I guess, dialectical relationship between the archive and the repertoire.
Yeah, well, it was really interesting, and like following this notion of the archive, I'm thinking of these new waves of using social media, for example, like Instagram or TikTok. There are these accounts that they publish new videos, or they publish some audios with, of course, image, and maybe like thinking this social media as a new archive instead of this website. Maybe using media as this new wave of transmission as well, and of an archive, like this notion of what you were talking about. So I think it's really interesting as well.
Yeah. I was just asked to write a chapter in a book that's coming out with the University of Massachusetts Press. I think it's going to be a digital online open access book. That's about social media and World Wide Web 2 and contemporary poetry. When I was asked about it, I feel like it's where I turn into a grumpy old man because I'm just like, no, like social media does just like it's the death of the digital repository, because you can't access, you can't find things, you know, like there's no the ability to retrieve things, like it's not good. And so I write a really cranky essay basically saying like everything that the digital has to offer to poetry, like we know in 1996. It's cranky. And I don't know if I actually think this. I'll have to think about it more. But yeah, you know, part of it is that in Instagram, say for instance, nobody really, in my mind, nobody really does interesting poetry that harnesses. I mean, I'd love to be shown otherwise. I'd love to be shown otherwise. You know, the most important example is somebody like Rupi Kaur, who's the Canadian like very famous Instagram poet. She's by far the most best-selling poet in North America over the past decade, probably for the past 50 years. So she could just kind of brush whatever I have to say away, because, but you know, I mean, maybe there's something interesting to say about it, but for me, the kind of poetry, say, that Rupi Kaur uses Instagram for is this kind of sort of very banal addressing of the lyric practices in a very specific form meant to fit the square of the Instagram thing. So it's, you know, maybe 8 to 12 lines of lineated personal expression. And so in an interesting way, like these social media forms, they really limit. Like I would like to see somebody do like, you know, wild, you know, performance-based poetry or something like that on Instagram or TikTok or something like that. I would like to see people both work in a way that exploits like understands the form of the stack of the way that things are circulated in social media, and that kind of break it in a certain way, because in breaking things we learn better how they're made. And I just haven't seen that. I haven't seen that in one of the most important works of digital poetry that I can think of is called Volume 1. I just put it there. This was done in maybe around 2010 or so, maybe, at a time where social media was really coming up. And it was done by 3 people, all funnily enough, in Philadelphia, University of Pennsylvania. And they did this incredible work where they created this mega digital anthology. And they wrote a script in code that harvested the internet for the 100 most popular names for poets on the internet, and they made that those 100 names authors of in the anthology. And then they wrote another script to write 300 poems. And this is before, way, like, you know, this is 12 years before ChatGPT and all these AI sort of modeling things. So they wrote this new script. And so in this mega anthology that was over 500 pages, published as a PDF on the internet, one day, all these poets woke up and they went on social media, and they saw that they were in an anthology that they were never asked to be a part of. And not only that, they go on and look at this anthology that they're a part of, and the poems that are published are not their poems. And so, funnily enough, you had all of these language poets like Ron Silliman, who's a poet that I genuinely adore. But it was funny because, you know, like different language poetics have always been about the universality, the commonality of language, how how language could be used and reused and recirculated in all of these ways. All of a sudden, and they were against the author, all of a sudden in this volume 1, seeing that they were in this anthology and it was not their poems, all of them wanted to assert their individuality and say, these are not my poems. They're like and they all of a sudden, poets had lawyers, and they were saying, whoever did this, I'm going to sue this person, like this is copyright infringement. And your earbud just fell out. I found this to be such a fascinating moment of, you know, social media poetry that doesn't quite use the form of social media, but uses the way that dialogue happens. Like, because everybody went onto Facebook and Twitter that morning bemoaning the fact that this anthology existed in the world. And for me, it was like one of the most exciting pieces of experimentation that somebody could do with language. Yeah, it was a really great event. It was a really great event.
I was wondering about if we could discuss a bit more, but I mean, we have already exceeded the time. Maybe leave it for another time. But actually, the relationship between the digital repository and the archive, because with Aurelio and with Miriam and the rest of the group, we have been discussing this over and over again.
Oh, cool.
And also the extent to which we can actually assume that we can be an organization that helps mirror, in a certain sense, the things that are already archived in other or through other media. No? We are not original in the sense that we are not making the recordings ourselves, most of them, and also the trajectory that we had to face from trying to archive as much as we could, no, Aurelio? the idea of having a very big repository, and discovering that it is not as easy to do as we hoped it would. But on the other hand, discovering the positive aspects of being like a repository that can show some examples, some extracts of things happening, of oral and poetic and also other artistic manifestations that can be viewed in a cross-category sense and analyzed also in that sense, no? Maybe Aurelio would like to say something about that, or Miriam. I don't know.
That was actually one of the, well, my question, one of the many questions, because I had a bunch of things to discuss, but maybe later. Just basically, yeah, this idea about like repositories and archives, how this was a whole discussion during your thesis defense, which actually helped me realize, like, yeah, like we have to define repositories from the very beginning, like what we meant by using the word repository in our project. And yeah, I mean, it's basically there were like these two poles gravitating on this idea of the repository that were either something like oriented to PennSound, like more institutionalized, respecting copyrights and like with a more structural structure hierarchy and stuff. And the other pole would be like something like II.v and something more grassroots, more even piracy.
Yeah.
No, there was always this tension between like how far we can go in both directions, or if we would find like a middle point. There are many questions that we have not answered about, for example, copyright. Um, the tension is still there now, but I mean, for example, files are downloadable as they are right now in our repository. So yeah, I mean, we're in like this middle ground in which, and there we have many questions about that, and you can give us like very, very good feedback about it. And it's also like the other thing is like now the problem is, yeah, for example, we recognize and we define repositories as different from archives. Then the next step is like how did you get it recognized as such? Like how do you make other people realize, for example, funding agencies, that it's not an archive and it's
Yeah.
a repository, but that it does even better things than archives, you know, like it gets.
Yeah.
And I think about like, for example, GLAM, like, no, this idea of galleries, libraries, archives, and museums in which our project would fit in an institutional world. But if we say like, well, yeah, it's not an archive, it's a repository. No, it's like
Yeah.
this kind of like very practical examples of how the
Yeah.
project survives either as a repository, as an archive.
Yeah, I put in the chat this wonderful essay by an information scientist and librarian named Kate Timer. This was a really big essay for me, Archives in Context and as Context. It's published by the Journal of Digital Humanities. I thought this was a really great essay, and it really, you know, digital repositories can hold archives. You know, and in my mind, the difference between a digital repository and like and an archive is that an archive has selection in the sense that one puts their selects a field and collects all the things from that thing. So like, you know, the minutes, an archive is like the minutes of the meeting of Poetica Sonora from, you know, and all of the audio recordings that an archive can be all of the audio recordings that Poetica Sonora has made from the beginning of the project to this day. And all of those recordings dated with the metadata, that's an archive. But once you start adding sort of personal choice to it, saying like, I like these 7 recordings from this, and I like, you know, these things, and once you start blending collections together, then it becomes a repository. So digital repositories have personal editorial selection involved in it as a protocol. And so I think, you know, one of the things that like, if you're talking to an information scientist about pitching, you know, for institutional support for your project as a digital repository, an information scientist will probably be like, yeah, great, you're calling it what it should be. But say other people who are maybe in the cultural sphere, archive has a gravitas to it because of Foucault, I guess, but or just cultural theory in general. We all know what archives are. We don't necessarily know what repositories are. And so yeah, so archive, you know, I mean, I tend to be pragmatic about these things, you know, if I'm talking to certain people that want to give me money and they might think that the thing that they might support, if it has more gravitas for them to not go into nuance, I would say archive. You know, and maybe this is just me being a wily kind of pragmatist around these things, but also I think one of the things that I want to do in this book is to really advocate for the importance of the form of the digital repository, because I think in advocating for the form of the digital repository, there's all these more and more interesting things that we can say by calling this thing what it is, and actually acknowledging the protocols for the construction of it. So I mean, it just depends on whether or not you want, like, you know, audio collections are like, they're incredibly fragile things. You know, the preservation of non-digital audio recordings, you know, they degrade intensely. You know, so there's a short life in which we can be active in order to preserve them, and to preserve them as digital recordings, to find the right conditions to preserve them as non-digital material formats. And so part of me is just like wants to advocate for whatever it takes to get the job done, and to be pragmatic about these things. I mean, that's my own thing, my own perspective on these things, because again, one of the things that I love about the PennSound model and the UBU web model to a certain extent, but and I connect this in my mind to the small press poetry tradition, is that you find the things that you like, you find the things that interest you, and you work with those things. And it's less of an institutional thing, but actually following the desire of what actually compels you. And so that for me is one of the most important things, and probably why I'm interested more in digital repositories than I am in archives, because there's a formality that is exceptionally important, and I love the work that archivists do. But I'm more interested in the repertoire of these archival things, the archival materials, and creating a liveliness out of them. But of course, archivists do this work too, in a important fundamental way. So yeah, it's complicated. It's complicated. It's tough work. It's tough work, I'm sure. Tough work to advocate for what it is in order to receive the support that you need to continue and to build this project.
Yeah. Does anyone want to make another question or comment? Because we should be closing soon. I wanted to ask you, Michael, is this new book downloadable, or have you printed it, and is it accessible? The one that you're going to promote?
The Aural Poetics
Yeah.
is not, because it's published by this incredible Swedish publisher that is very much, they have very little digital trace. And they're really into the material object. I even published a project with them years ago and asked 2 years afterwards if they mind that I put, you know, my things on my site, because I like to make, you know, my writings accessible there. And they're just like, you could, we won't get upset with you, but we'd prefer not to. And I'm just like, okay, that's cool. I can see if I can send you guys a couple copies of it though, because I think, you know, there's some really wonderful work. Incredible Navajo composer Raven Chacon has, like, for me, some of the most fascinating work in there. He just won the Pulitzer Prize for music a few weeks ago, which was a big deal. Cecilia Vicuña is in it, who's one of my favorite poets, and translations from Spanish into English by a really wonderful translator, Daniel Brzezinski. Yeah, there's a lot of, it's I want to call it a hodgepodge, but it's because it really it's some of it are essays, some of it are very performance documentation. So it's a real mix of works, some poems, musical scores, all sorts of things. So if there's anything that you wanted to see in it, though, I think I have the table of contents up on my site at some point. Just let me know and I'll send it to you, back channel it to you.
Thank you so much. Yes, that would be great. So anyone, one last question or comment? I mean,
Just
it's not going to be. Yeah.
Just quickly wanted to congratulate Michael for retaking this project about, like, taking your dissertation and turning it into a book, because the dissertation is huge, and it's I mean, yeah, like, we've been talking about this for a while during the years, and then the pandemic hit, and I'm looking forward to reading this book when it comes out.
Thank you for saying that. And I'll say this to you all as like grad students, researchers, etc. It's a funny thing happened. I completed my dissertation and I felt so embarrassed by it. I like put on all just because, you know, there were all these decisions that I couldn't decide on making. So my way was just including everything. And I wanted to make a text that was a repository itself. And so I knew that there was something that was important in what I was arguing for, but I always felt it was like insufficient. And I think part of the reason why I didn't touch it for 5 years is because I felt this deep embarrassment about how I addressed a lot of the things in there. So I just bring that up just to say, like, you know, like, I mean, our thoughts and our activities and our scholarship and our thinking together is very tender. It can be very tender, and we become vulnerable in sharing these things with the world. And one of the ways that I've actually felt good about it again is actually discussing it with folks like you and saying like, and being like, oh, you know, like there's something that I should really do with this thing. And you know, this can be helpful or contributes in one way to all these discussions other people are having elsewhere and things like that. So I think it's really in allowing myself to just be okay with actually trying to share these ideas with other and entering into dialogue. That you know, this thing that we do is research feels valuable.
Yes, definitely, and I think it should be also encouraging for those who have already presented their thesis and their PhDs. Hopefully, they also take an example of this. And the ones who are about to finish, there are many interesting projects that we will surely be sharing with you. Most of the students that you have met today are students in English literature. And
great.
Strangely enough, they have all been interested in joining this project, which is not about English literature. It doesn't exclude those manifestations, but yes, in fact, we are wanting to broaden up the scope. Also, you mentioned the languages, the indigenous languages, the ones that are spoken still and are very active here in Mexico. There are many examples that we are already finding and are going to try to analyze. The problem is that we don't speak those languages either.
Yeah.
So yeah, but there are many things coming up for us, and this has been truly a super opportunity to get to know your work closer, and also your reflections on your work and how it has developed over the years. Yes, Jorge has already left, so
yeah. Thank you all. I really hope, please share with me I would love to read about Susan Howe. I'd love to read about Natalie Diaz. So please share with me anything that you're working on. You know, here's my email. And yeah, I think for sure that I'll come down to Mexico City for the next Index Book Fair, which is in January. So I would love to meet with you all. If that's possible, then I think you might be away, Susanna. I think you're on your
sabbatical. Yes.
Yeah, good for you. Yeah.
But I will hope that we can invite you further on as well. I mean, you might meet those who are in Mexico, but yeah, let's keep in touch, Michael, and continue collaborating. It would be great to do something together.
I would love it.
Yeah,
I would love it. Yeah.